Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Describing the Goals of Chaplaincy. I'm Andrew Andresco, Project Coordinator for Transforming Chaplaincy, and we are delighted you could all join us. We have well over 400 registrants, so we're very excited about today's presentation. Some housekeeping instructions off the top. You are listening in using your computer speaker system by default and are muted. Should you have any technical questions regarding your audio or visual, please type those into the chat box located in the platform's dashboard. At the end of today's presentation, we're going to be promoting our upcoming webinars and educational opportunities. We've included some QR codes in those slides, so if you have your smartphones ready, it's easy just to take a picture of that, and that will take you right to the respective websites. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. George Visser, Director of Transforming Chaplaincy.
Hey, Andy, thanks so much for your support. Welcome, everybody. We're really glad to have you with us today. I'm George Visser. I'm a chaplain at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago and the Director of Transforming Chaplaincy. Catherine Lyons was going to be our moderator today, but some things have come up, so Catherine's not going to be available, so I'm going to fill in for her. I have to say I'm really excited about this paper and about this webinar and this chance to talk about it with our panelists, our presenters, and with you. As a chaplain researcher, I'm just really interested in the whole question about outcomes research. And when I read the third paragraph of this paper, I was hooked. And I knew that we had to do a webinar on the paper. So here's the third paragraph, right? In which Anja and her colleagues say, what do chaplains say about what they as a profession contribute to the lives of their clients? When it is clear what chaplains want to contribute, it'll also be much clearer about what might constitute relevant outcomes, namely, those that indicate whether or not chaplains have achieved their goals. And so we have a really important description of the goals of chaplaincy and looking forward to sharing that with you. The article was written by Anja Visser and her colleagues, Annalika Dahmen and Carmen Schumann. Anja is Assistant Professor of Spiritual Care on the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Groningen in Groningen, the Netherlands. I've been reading your work, Anja, for a long time and just always impressed with it and really excited about this paper and glad to have you here. Our respondents to the paper are Allison Kestenbaum, who's an ACPE Supervisor of Spiritual Care Services and Clinical Pastoral Education at the University of California in San Diego. And great to have you with us, Allison. Also joining us is Simon Lasserre. Simon is a certified spiritual care practitioner, and he's the Robert Steen Holistic Research Chair and visiting researcher and research associate at St. Thomas More College and St. Paul's Hospital on Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And finally, we have Pamela McCarroll. Pamela is the Vice Principal and Associate Professor of Practical Theology at Emmanuel College in the University of Toronto. Pamela is a certified supervisor educator within the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care and a registered psychotherapist in the province of Ontario. Andy, while I'm talking, why don't you go to the next slide. Friends, this is the title of the article in case you haven't seen the titles in the promotion. You want to look it up. It's in the Journal of Healthcare Chaplaincy. For those of us in the US who are members of APC and ACPE, you can download the article for free through your organization's website. Our procedure will be to turn this over to Anja and let her present a summary of the article. Then Allison and Simon and Pamela are going to offer a few minutes of response, and then we're going to come back into conversation. I think that is going to take most of the 60 minutes for the webinar, so I don't think we're going to have time for questions and answers from the participants, but if you have a burning question or comment and you do want to put it in the question box, please feel free to do that. We'll try to take a look at it and see if we can have any time for that, but I'm not sure we will. Anja, really glad to have you here today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to present on this paper and have this conversation about it, because actually that was our whole goal of writing this paper, to really start a conversation on, well, what is going on here in chaplaincy? How do we look at this field? And then especially at the content of the field. So yeah, I wrote this paper with two of my colleagues from the University of Humanistic Studies. I hope Carmen actually made it here today. Before I go into the details of the study, I first want to talk a little bit about how we could think about goals and what in this study we mean with goals. So if we can have the next slide, please. And another click, yes, thank you. When thinking about goals in chaplaincy, I found that we often get into a bit of a conflict, because you could think about the rationale behind a certain profession or a certain thing that we do in, you might say, two different ways. And this has been articulated by Weber and by Mannheim, among others. You could say, well, a profession has a certain goal rationality, or even an act has a certain goal rationality, right? The things that we do are guided by goals, by what we would like to achieve with the things that we do. And then the rationality is acts are rational when they contribute to achieving this goal. So in terms of ethics, you might think of a sort of this reflecting a consequentialist ethics, where you judge what is good by the outcome that it has. Whereas another way of thinking about why we do what we do is that our acts are guided by values. They're guided by things that we find important, and we're being rational when we choose goals and acts that conform to these values. So you might say this sort of, a bit in a stretch maybe, but this sort of reflects a virtue ethics, where, you know, what is good is what reflects these values, what is virtuous. And what we see in chaplaincy often is that these value rationality is the thing that is how we often talk about chaplaincy, right? Chaplaincy is there because it represents certain values, and that's what we're trying to realize. But at the same time, and then, you know, this goal rationality feels kind of icky maybe, but at the same time, you can also see from these definitions that goals and values are very much related, because we choose our goals based on what we value, and the goals reflect these values. And if we zoom, so these two things are not separate. Values and goals are not necessarily very different things. If we zoom in on this goal rationality, and if we use that to look at, okay, so what are we doing within chaplaincy, within spiritual care? There's a further distinction that you could make between practice goals and contact goals. And I based the definitions here on the work of Job Smith, who's a Dutch chaplain who has recently written a dissertation on what he calls the basic method of chaplaincy. And he's thought also a lot about goals in chaplaincy, what sort of represents what all chaplains do. And he makes the distinction between practice goals, so a central goal or value to be realized within chaplaincy as a whole. So regardless of the chaplain, regardless of the patient, regardless of context or situation, if we look at chaplaincy as a whole, this is what we try to realize. And contact goals, they represent the goals of a specific contact between a specific client or patient, a specific chaplain in a very specific context or situation. So these are also often much smaller goals, right? The things that you hope that will happen within one conversation maybe, or one contact or a series of contacts, but not a whole lot further than that. And a final distinction that we might be able to make, one more click please, is between intrinsic and extrinsic goals. So both practice goals and context goals can be thought of as either intrinsic or extrinsic. And this is another thing that Job Smith explains. Intrinsic goals represent what is intended within chaplaincy. So this is often, you know, you might say that when you talk to a patient or a chaplain about, well, what are you hoping for with your work or with this contact, you will be speaking about intrinsic goals, really the things that happen in the chaplaincy encounter. Whereas extrinsic goals are things that are intended through chaplaincy, right? Because chaplaincy contributes to a lot more than just the things that happen within that context. They might contribute to higher well-being of a whole population, or they might contribute to higher quality of life of patients while they're in, you know, while they're in hospital. They might contribute to cost reduction, they might contribute to more social justice. But these are goals that you often don't, you know, that first of all might be achieved by lots of different disciplines, so are not necessarily specific to chaplaincy, but that are also not immediately related to the chaplaincy encounter. They're sort of secondary things that happen because there's a chaplain present and you have contact with people. Now, if we look at our study, next slide, please. What we intended to do was to find out what are the intrinsic practice goals of chaplaincy care in the Netherlands. So we were really trying to focus on the things that happen within the profession of chaplaincy and for that might be applicable to the profession as a whole. So regardless of context and person and situation, etc. We did limit it to the Netherlands also because, well, this is a huge question, so you need to make it smaller in several ways. But also the organization of chaplaincy in the Netherlands is slightly different than in other countries. So also to understand what is being said, it was important for us to limit it to this context that we as Dutch researchers and chaplains also know best. So what we did to try to figure this out is we looked in the literature, lots of different literature, but we did look for literature on chaplaincy by chaplains. So it was very important to us to figure out, okay, what are chaplains themselves saying about their profession? And we focused on publications from 2014 onward. And the reason for that is that in 2014, the way we look at chaplaincy in the Netherlands shifted somewhat, or maybe even quite drastically, because a new group of chaplains was recognized, which were the general or non-denominational chaplains. And just to make clear what I mean when I'm saying non-denominational, this also excludes humanistic chaplains that in a lot of countries are considered the non-denominational people, but in the Netherlands, humanism is, in chaplaincy at least, not necessarily outside of that, but in chaplaincy we kind of treat it as another denomination. And non-denominational chaplains are really ones that don't have a specific religious or life view sanction for their work. What we identified were 72 publications from 2014 onward that we felt described chaplaincy by chaplains. And then we looked at the text and selected fragments that we thought described these practice goals. And so we ended up with 36 publications that contained 111 fragments that had some sort of goal description. But what happened then is that we wanted to categorize them because, I mean, it shows up really quickly that, you know, the people are trying to describe the same thing, but they use all kinds of different language. So we were thinking, okay, can we make this a bit more clear and find out, okay, what are the commonalities? What are the differences? Can we identify some specific goals? And while in that process, we quickly also realized that, well, some fragments were really, you know, vague, or they didn't describe practice goals, but they described contact goals, or lots of other things happened. So we ultimately ended up with 86 text fragments from 33 publications that we felt described intrinsic practice goals to chaplaincy, though that intrinsic part is up for debate, which I will get to later. Next slide, please. So these are the categories of goals that we identified or created, because I'm sure that if another team of researchers would have done this, they might have ended up with a different categorization. I'm not sure, but it doesn't seem impossible to me. And what you're seeing here is in the plaque, there are 6 main goals. These are really large categories of describing what chaplaincy is here for, or what chaplains try to do. But we also figured out, we kind of ran into the problem that there are a lot of different levels of practice goals that you can distinguish. Some are really quite theoretical and broad, while other authors were much more specific about, you know, this is what we're intending to do as chaplains, often in our context. So you also see in the different shades of gray various sub-goals. I will try to keep it short as possible, but I do want to sort of explain what these different categories mean. The largest category that we found, so what most text fragments described, was the category of what we call the worldview, vitality, and plausibility, and we borrowed that name from the work of Job Smit. And what this describes is that chaplains said that what they hope for is that patients develop a worldview that helps them to engage with life, basically. So that's motivating, that's that helps them to integrate themselves in life, that helps them to move through life. But we saw that different authors spoke about sort of different steps in this process of you know, helping patients, clients to develop such a type of worldview. One step was clarifying one's worldview, so really helping the person to figure out, okay, so what actually is my worldview? And within that, some authors spoke about, well, what we also really try to do is clarify the identity, you know, help the person figure out who I am. And this then, you know, also contributes to this larger worldview part. Another sub-goal was personalizing a worldview, so helping the person to really make a religious worldview or something else their own, so they could have a lived worldview, so to say. Others said, and this personalizing and integrating are kind of similar, but maybe start from a different angle. Integrating new perspectives, I've used the short titles because else the slide would be too full. The full title of this sub-goal is integrating new perspectives. The idea behind that was, well, in your own lived worldview, sometimes it's really important to be able to find new perspectives. So chaplains described helping the patient find new perspectives or formulating their perspectives and then integrating this into their larger worldviews. And very specifically, we found in descriptions of Muslim prison chaplaincy, the goal of integrating elements of worldview tradition, so really helping prisoners in this case to integrate parts of Islam within their lives. And within the military context, we also found several references to helping people to integrate moral perspectives, different moral perspectives into their worldviews. Well, we can probably all imagine why that would be a goal in the military. Another sub-goal of this worldview vitality, so all these things also sort of contribute to this overarching goal, was living one's worldview. So, and here we also see, you know, a connection probably with all the other sub-goals, that, you know, you also want to express your worldview and be able to bring this into practice. So this is also what some chaplains described, and particularly some said, well, this is also very important because this helps with existential resilience, with better understanding different kinds of situations in life, and, you know, being able to deal with life better. And the final subcategory in this was answering life questions. So you also already see that there are connections there with the previous category. And what this described was using your worldview and adjusting your worldview to answer larger questions about life. And so that also kind of relates to the identity, clarification of identity. So, you know, large life, well, we all know large life questions. And so they described, well, one of the goals of chaplaincy is to help patients to use their worldview to answer these questions, and then, of course, integrating these answers back into the worldview. Now, that last category seems really similar to the second large category that we found, which was processing life events. The main difference between worldview vitality and answering life questions specifically and processing life events is the level at which this happens. So if we take the model of Crystal Park as a sort of a frame of reference, then answering life questions and worldview vitality and plausibility happen on a global level. So this really involves a view on, you know, life as a whole, sort of, to the extent that you can do that, but this really big level, whereas processing life events is really on this situational level. So for this specific situation or similar situations, how do I process these? So this also kind of relates to, you know, processes of coping, although what we noted was that the chaplains actually hardly used the word coping. I think it occurred maybe once. So this was not the language in which they described this goal. A goal that was mentioned less often was deepening spirituality. And here, I think language issues also come in, because in English, spirituality means a slightly different thing than it does in Dutch. But this deepening spirituality category was more about how you relate to your life and yourself. So there's a bit more affective element to it, and a bit more of a subjective element as well. It's a bit less cognitive than the worldview, vitality, and processing life events. And specifically within this category, there was the goal of finding inner motivation, trust, hope, inspiration, strength, zeal. So really, you know, finding joy or the desire to, you know, do stuff. And the second more specific goal within this larger category was of spiritual growth and human flourishing. So this really was a humanizing kind of category. Yeah, I'm already talking far too long. So I'm gonna sort of go really quickly through the last three. Relational affirmation, I think, kind of speaks for itself, right? This is what chaplains very often describe through my relationship with the patient. You know, they feel seen and heard and recognized as a person. Well-being, sometimes it was specified really specifically as spiritual well-being or existential well-being, but some of the authors, and this was only 3 or 4 authors that mentioned this, but it was broader well-being. And the final was one that was mentioned least often, but that we did feel was important, is the goal of allowing patients to exercise their freedom of religion. So these chaplains described, well, the fact that I'm there, and the importance of our profession in the context in which we work is that it allows people to exercise this fundamental right. Okay, last slide. Of course, this is just the start of something. Actually, the research raised many more questions to us than it actually answered, which I'm also very happy to have this conversation now. Like one of the questions that raised was, well, some people say that well-being is the overarching goal, so that all of these other things ultimately contribute to well-being. How might that be true or not? Is well-being even an intrinsic goal? Because of course, lots of professions contribute to well-being. Is this really something that, you know, happens inside this chaplaincy encounter? How does this generalize to other contexts, fields, religions, even to group work? Because we focused on individual one-to-one chaplaincy goals. What is the relationship between practice and context goals, right? The relationship between what all chaplains do and what a chaplain does in a very specific encounter with a specific person in a specific situation. How do different views on this relate, right? This was a chaplaincy view, chaplains describing their work. How does that work with other care colleagues? Do they describe the same types of goals for chaplaincy? How do clients or patients describe this? So, well, lots to figure out. We are taking our first steps to do that. So we're currently conducting interviews with patients and clients, and we're holding focus groups between chaplains, other care colleagues, and clients in the primary care setting, that should be said, to, well, try to answer some of these questions already. That's it for now. Lots said. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Anja. Wonderful job. It's a really important paper. Appreciate your working hard to kind of give us the highlights of it in such a short period of time. Allison, come on back on and share your response with us.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all today. You could go to the next slide. So huge appreciation for Anja and the authors of this work, just what you've undertaken here, to reiterate what George had shared, I think is such a wonderful contribution to our field worldwide. And I know for myself, in reading this article and processing what your findings and thinking those through, I've found that it has helped me to better articulate the goals of chaplaincy to my administrators, to team members, to learners, to funders, and most importantly to the recipients of our care. So to be able to have this broader conversation that's now happening in the literature and amongst us all as colleagues, I think it only helps to strengthen our ability to speak with clarity about this work that we for so long anecdotally could assess the value, but now are seeing that more and more in an evidence-based way. I also wanted to just acknowledge that you mentioned a few times in the article and in your presentation today about, I think you called it well-being. To me, it sort of jumped in my mind to this concept of wellness, which is everywhere right now. That's probably another webinar. But we're talking so much about wellness for ourselves as chaplains, for members of the interprofessional team, if you're working in healthcare, and really just in general. And so it's very exciting for me to see research that actually helps us to understand what that word means. And even more exciting to see how it's aligned with some of the values and goals and practices of chaplaincy, which is something that, again, anecdotally, I've always thought that chaplains are, one of the experts in facilitating that kind of wellness. But to be able to see how you've articulated that here has been really helpful to me. So the respondents were asked to respond to the following 3 questions. And so I'm going to do that through a couple of slides here. You can go to the next one. The first question was, should we have goals for chaplaincy? And my first bullet is, are we not past this question? Which is a little bit of a glib way to respond. But I think it is important to say that I think we are at a point now where mostly we have some consensus that we do need goals for chaplaincy. Certainly this work, indicates the value of that. I think it's important to recognize that there was a time where there wasn't consensus on that, and maybe there might still be some detractors. But I do want to acknowledge that I believe that we are in a moment now where there is that general consensus, and perhaps that is something to celebrate, that we are in general as a profession, even if you just look at the professional standards, the guidelines that help us to determine who should be certified as a chaplain, at least in the context of the APC, for example, or how we train our chaplains through the ACPE, which are the organizations that I'm connected with, that terminology is much more present, and that's something that we're looking for folks to be able to demonstrate. So I would say, yes, we should have goals for chaplaincy, and part of the nuance for me is, should we have goals? Yes, but what's the nature of those goals? Okay, so an example that I would offer is sometimes when I present material about outcome-based chaplaincy, about goals of chaplaincy, about spiritual assessment, which I think really aligns with this idea of chaplains having goals for their work, and how we integrate that into the plan of care. Sometimes what I hear from researchers from other disciplines is it's very mixed. Sometimes I'll hear them say, oh, this is great because we need to put this in terms of we need to put this in scientific terms so that we can measure this, and therefore this work can have sustainability and be adopted broadly. Other folks have said, stop trying to shoehorn into our world. It is reasonable and valid to expect that spiritual care can be conceived and implemented in an evidence-based manner, but it's okay that it's different. And that really made me think a little bit about, we'll get a little more to this in the next slide, but just this idea that there are ways in which there's this intrinsic unique value to chaplaincy, right? And so I think this paper has done a really great job of lifting that up and beginning to tease that out. I also wanted to just acknowledge, I was really fascinated by the work about internal goals that was referenced by Anja and her co-authors, which was inspired, I believe, by McIntyre's work. And that really resonated with me because I think it really helps to explain some sort of like the psyche of chaplains and how we think about our work. Really, again, going back to those values. When I was reading all this, I was very immersed in the high holy days for the Jewish tradition and thinking very much about return and repentance. But the reason why I bring that up is because that's what I think goals are. So, again, back to this question of should we have goals as chaplain? It's like, well, yes, simply, it's just returning back to the core of what is important to us. So I have a couple of quotes here. I'll wrap up in great 2 minutes. Perfect, that's all I need. So this might be the only time that Rabbi Aidan Steinsaltz and Peter Drucker have ever been quoted on the same slide. But I just really resonated with this idea that all forms of return, however diverse and complex, have a common core, that human beings have the power to affect inward change. And that's what I think goals are about, coming back to that true north. And then this quote from Peter Drucker: do not measure your life by your goals, but what you're doing to achieve them. So I think that this work really lifts that up. And this quote from the paper here: the aim never fully or permanently reached. People's life circumstances change over time, but it's just about being reattuning to that. And that's what I think is we do as chaplains with our goals. So I guess I'm trying to say, let's not be afraid of goals. They have a lot of inherent connection to our work as chaplains. So just one more slide here. And then this question of, can the goals from the Dutch context be useful in starting place? Absolutely. I would say it would be interesting to know if we could replicate the study. I think we probably could. It would be really interesting to see that from our context. And then one thing that I would say in the replication, I would love to hear more, maybe if we do have some time for Q&A, is there was a part in the paper that said that there was consensus about the various findings. And I guess I would just want to know a little bit more about that process. If we could just go to the next slide here, and I'll just wrap up. So this idea that that's on page 5 of the paper here in the categorizations. How was that consensus reached? I think that would really be good to know in our context. There was also a brief quote from the paper that talked about how some of the work around minority religious and spiritual voices was rather undeveloped. And I think in our context, that would be really important to look at how that is involved, because I do think various minority faith and religious and cultural traditions do have voices in the chaplaincy world. And I would want to see that mentioned in any replication done in our context. Thank you.
Allison, thanks so much. Really appreciate your response. Simon, you're up.
Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and I'm really excited to be part of this conversation and to bring some perspectives from my part of Canada to this conversation. And as I offer you this response, I want to indicate that my own orientation in research is somewhat theoretical, and so that approach is reflected in the thoughts that I have to offer here. I want to begin my response by thanking the authors of this article for offering a very stimulating engagement with the question of the goals of chaplaincy care. In settings where chaplains and spiritual care practitioners are increasingly called upon to explain their work and demonstrate how it benefits patients and clients, this article offers some excellent insights regarding how Dutch chaplains understand what they do. I believe there is much here to chew on, not only for chaplains in the Netherlands, but also in my own Canadian context. For those who aren't familiar with me or my publications, I live and work in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan, where in 2017, the provincial government eliminated all funds to spiritual care in publicly owned and operated healthcare facilities. When the government did this, they stated 2 reasons for doing so. 1, governments can't be in the business of funding Christian theology in public healthcare, and 2, why fund spiritual care when nurses, social workers, and community clergy can provide these services? There's a lot I could say to critique these two statements. However, in this response, I want to focus on what constructing an alternative narrative might look like and how the article we're discussing today contributes to that narrative. As I've thought about Saskatchewan's elimination of spiritual care funds since 2017, I believe part of what enabled our government to eliminate these funds was our inability as spiritual care professionals to communicate what we do, how we do it, and why it's important. At that time, the research literature was urging us to adopt outcomes-oriented approaches to our work. Yet I think at the front lines, we were still struggling with how that approach could be successfully implemented. Due to these struggles, we were limited in our capacity to consistently demonstrate the value of our work to other professionals and those who provided our funding. I think we were also needing to do a significant amount of public advocacy. These realities, I believe, made it easy for Saskatchewan's government to eliminate spiritual care funds in its 2017 austerity budget. Spiritual care was a proverbial low-hanging fruit that could easily be plucked from the tree. How then to position spiritual care and chaplaincy so funders and other stakeholders will be less likely to dismiss our work? Next slide, please. I believe the answer lies primarily in constructing chaplaincy-specific concepts and language to describe our practices and their outcomes. I was therefore very happy to see that Anja Visser, Annalika Dahmen, and Carmen Schumann included a statement to this effect in their paper. By constructing chaplaincy or spiritual care specific language and concepts, we will be better able to provide a coherent account of what we do, how we do it, and why it's important. At this point, we are lacking this kind of integrated approach to our work, and no wonder there are so many calls in the research literature right now for the creation of a comprehensive theory of chaplaincy and spiritual care. For my own part, I've attempted to respond to these calls in my own published work, and Visser, Dahmen, and Schumann's article is also contributing to this discussion by offering a compelling picture of how Dutch publications describe the goals of chaplaincy care. This is a welcome and much needed contribution, but where do we go from here? To distinguish chaplaincy and spiritual care from other cognate professions, I believe it is necessary to carve out the unique space we occupy in relation to social workers, psychologists, and nurses who practice spiritual care and/or spiritually integrated psychotherapy. This is a challenging undertaking because to carve out this space, we need to be conversant with the concepts and practices that inform each of these professions. But even more so, we need to identify what is distinctive to our own profession. And to this point, this is where we remain somewhat challenged, even though this article and other publications have been doing quite a good job in illuminating some of these unique distinguishing points for chaplaincy and spiritual care. Regardless, here's where I think we can continue to build on the work that we're talking about today. For the most part, Canada, the USA, and I'll be done in just a couple minutes, Canada, the USA, and many chaplaincy organizations internationally still require their members to be formed in some way by their own faith traditions. At least in Canada, even humanist and atheist spiritual care practitioners need to be formed in the teachings and tenets of their own faith, of their respective secular traditions. These formations are then brought into conversation with other traditions through the chaplain's further training in clinical pastoral education. The result is that chaplains and spiritual care practitioners are specifically trained to engage patients' and clients' specific beliefs about reality, the transcendent, and the divine in ways that other medical or mental health professionals are not. I think these are, I think there still remains some very large questions that need to be responded to. And I think that Anja did an excellent job in outlining those questions. And I think that as this research develops and as we continue to dialogue about it in the research literature, it's an exciting time to be part of this field because all of us are going to be impacted by this work, particularly when it comes to maintaining our jobs and providing a coherent account of what it is that we do. So in the end, what I want to say is that this article is an indispensable piece of work, so it's an honor for me to thank its authors for their efforts.
Simon, thanks so much for your response. Pamela, do you want to join us and share your thoughts about this?
Absolutely. Yes. Thanks so much, all. Thank you to the authors. This is a fabulous article, as you've heard, and I've been to be recommending it to my students, my doctoral students, particularly because the methodology is so clear, and I love that, as well as the content is so good. Just a little bit more background in terms of where I'm coming from. I'm teaching at a school where we have, we teach program in spiritual care, degree program, spiritual care and psychospiritual therapy, with specialization in Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist focus, as well as sort of spiritually fluid and integrated. Next slide, please. So I'm responding to the 3 questions they gave us, and I have 3 slides here. So I'm just going to follow that through and move as quickly as I can. So should we have goals for chaplaincy? I mean, I agree with what Allison's saying, that isn't this question redundant now. At the same time, I see across, when we're doing some studies across Canada and all sorts of different sectors of chaplaincy, there is still some resistance, especially for those who are not within the larger chaplaincy professional associations. So the resistance is around sort of reductionism and the fear of reducing care into measurable parts. The focus in chaplaincy is this holistic approach to being human. And so how do goals actually undermine that? So there's an anxiety because it's the fear of it being reductionistic. And the other thing, and these 2 challenges of a shared language or fear about falling to the lowest common denominator, these 2 are sort of 2 sides of a similar coin. On the one hand, challenges regarding a shared language, there's a sense in which there can be an implicit colonizing through the language that we use to describe what we're doing or describe the goals. And so that language kind of has a kind of implicit cosmology or worldview, as the article used that terminology. And so that's something we have to be very careful about. And I had some of those questions coming up in my mind also as I was reading the article. And then there's fear about the lowest common denominator, or watering it down, or not having the specificity, that if we have language that can be shared, is it going to be so watered down that the specificity and the uniqueness of what it is we offer is lost? So those are there, I think, where the resistance comes from. Of course, I believe, yes, we have to have goals for chaplaincy. It's pragmatic to do so, and there's really this shift in a lot of literature. I know Transforming Chaplaincy's done a lot on this, as well as some of the other, Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, doing a lot of research around how the professionalization of chaplaincy is really underway fully, certainly in North America, and obviously as well in parts of Europe. So how do we develop a shared language that's porous enough that we can sort of allow for the particularities of diverse beliefs and practices and cosmologies, while also having enough clarity to communicate both internally and externally about the goals or what it is we do. Identifying goals, the scope of practice, there's a sense in which if we have these goals, and I think both Allison and Simon referred to this, the intra-professional competence, we're able to talk about what it is we do, we're able to assess and sort of explore evidence-based sort of assessment around what it is we're doing, and then also the interprofessional and the client-based conversations around what it is we do. And then in terms of framing the sources and norms for practice and competence, it strikes me that the goals, as Anja was describing them, really set things up sort of this big picture so that we can consider what are the common sources for our theories and the norms by which we practice, and how do those play out in terms of our the competencies that are implied there. Next chapter, please. Next slide, yes, thanks. And I think the article does a really good job at parsing out some of those pieces. In terms of goals from the Dutch context that are useful, I tended to bunch the first 3 and potentially the first 4 as I'm sort of thinking about this relational affirmation goal that was described. under meaning making goals. And I know in the North American context, this language of meaning making is something that's quite dominant. And so the worldview, vitality and plausibility, processing life events, deepening spirituality, and I think even relational affirmation as it's described in the article, which actually has as much to do about presence and it's kind of more embodied way of affirming the meaningfulness of a person's life through that sort of way of being, that quality of presence that's there. That's what I picked up in some of the rereadings I've been doing on this relational affirmation category. And then I was really interested in this exercising of freedom of religion, a study that a colleague, Angela Schmidt, and I are doing, and we're updating it right now about what chaplains do in the Canadian context. How do they define what they do and describe what they do across multiple sectors? And one of the things that kept coming up, and increasingly so over the last 10 years, was this exercising of the freedom of religion and brokering that within institutional settings, particularly in corrections and prisons, but also in the military as well as in healthcare and some of the other contexts. And bringing that in as a goal is really, really helpful, I think, because, I mean, there are all sorts of implications about how that's done in terms of competencies required for that goal to be reached. However, when we were doing the study, we kept sort of finding this coming up, but didn't have a way of integrating it into what, the kinds of overall goals of chaplaincy that were sort of implicit in our own understanding. So this was really, really helpful on how that can feed into flourishing in some form or another. Next slide, please. Okay, this is very little printing. I'm sorry about that. So what changes would you make in these goals? Okay, I see you, George. That means I have 2 minutes, I think. Is that right? Okay. The article mentions this, and the top left square says embedded anthropology. The embedded anthropology very much normalized an autonomous, rational individual, and the article talked about this. And so I just want to expand that to draw on embedded ecology, communal, relational formation. How is it that we are full embodied beings, and what does chaplaincy have to do with that, and the goals? How do we connect with that? Goals as desired outcomes. Okay, I was thinking of it in those terms. So I reformulated and sort of reworked some of these goals, thinking about meaning making, vitality, and congruence, which would hold several of those goals under interpersonal, and spiritual well-being. Congruence, I thought, instead of plausibility, mostly because plausibility seems to be an objective out there, external objective that we are measuring according to, as opposed to an internal kind of congruence there. So that was something I wondered about. Relational well-being, I thought taking the well-being piece and integrating it throughout relational well-being in our research, counseling, and relational well-being with ourselves, with others, with creation, in all sorts of ways, was a real priority and has come out as very important in terms of counseling practices that chaplains engage in outcome-based counseling practices. Exercising of religious freedom, which is great. And then I added this social and organizational well-being because I think that is so intrinsic to what chaplains do in terms of thinking about ways to work within a system and nurture the spiritual dimension of a system, of an organization. And so how do we talk about that, that sort of organizational and structural, that includes all sorts of ways systems can be oppressive, can undermine human flourishing, and trying to attend to that and really shift it so that there are practices that engage and invite this kind of flourishing of an organization as a whole. So I think about things, having worked in healthcare, like the role of the memorial service or debriefing sessions after a traumatic incident that are kind of ritualized ways that chaplains facilitate for social and organizational well-being. So I offer you that, and thank you so much to the authors and to the fellow panelists. Great opportunity here. and to transforming chaplaincy.
Thanks, Pamela. Let me invite everyone to come back for a few minutes. And Anja, I don't know if you want to have a chance to respond to any of the things that you've heard. Let's start the conversation. It's going to be a short conversation. It's going to be 3 minutes.
Yeah, but I would really like to take a bit of those 3 minutes. First of all, thank you so much for your responses and for your very thoughtful responses as well. It really feels like, you know, you've taken in what we have written and also made it your own. And I was very happy to hear that you've also found it useful, that you've already found ways to put this into practice, and yeah, that it has helped you in some way. That's always, of course, the biggest honor of doing scholarly work, when people actually feel that they can do something with it. Two specific things, Pamela, thank you so much for these alternative formulations of these goals. I think, well, we should definitely have a follow-up conversation on this. But yeah, I recognize a lot of what you've been saying, and this meaning making, we have been discussing it within the group as a concept, but we've also found, well, some difficulties relating to that. So it would be wonderful to explore these 4 overarching goals that you mentioned further. I think it's very thought-provoking, and I really recognize how this might also work. Allison, you asked about the process of reaching consensus. So the consensus was really just between the 3 of us. So we haven't yet checked consensus with anyone else. That's what we're currently doing in the focus groups that we're having. But the consensus really involved a lot of talking with each other. So we've spent hours going over, you know, these tiny little words and talking about, well, how are you interpreting this? How are you reading that? Well, in that piece of the text, it says this. Oh, what's the intertextuality here? You know, what authors are these people drawing on? So how might we be able to understand this? And also, and through all of these conversations, at some point we kind of felt, well, we feel like this might, you know, be what this means. And these concepts might work for this, but I think, as Pamela mentioned, and I think Simon also mentioned, this issue with language is super sensitive, because if you choose one word, that means that some meanings are lost, or, you know, you lose a little bit of nuance that's specific to a certain language. So yeah, it's, you know, there's also some pragmatism there. This is the best we could come up in the time period that we took, which was 3 years, by the way. I mean, this was not a short process. Yeah, so it reaching consensus to the extent that we could reach a consensus, or at least say, well, for now it's good enough, let's just put it out there and see what happens. That was a lot of talking. Yeah. I think those were my first main responses.
Thank you, Anja. On my clock, we're a minute from the top of the hour, so I'm going to have to be really firm here and kind of thank all of the panelists, the respondents. Thank Anja for starting a wonderful conversation. We hope this is a beginning of a conversation in our profession, the United States, North America, around the world with each other. We think it's a pretty important kind of question to be aware of, to explore, and we're really grateful for the help all of you have given to help us start. As we kind of wrap up, I want to kind of do a little bit of promotion about some upcoming activities. Andy, in the United States, the last week of October is called Spiritual Care Week. We're calling October Spiritual Care Month. So just want to draw your attention to the fact that next week on Thursday and Friday, no, it's on Wednesday and Thursday, there'll be a two-day conference on theory and practice of telechaplaincy. We're sponsoring this with colleagues at the University of Zurich, and really excited about that. So hope if you're involved in telechaplaincy, you can join for that. Andy, the following week on Tuesday, we're going to have a webinar on the role of chaplains in providing bereavement support. We have a lot of time and effort goes into that, but we haven't really thought a lot about what are the strengths and weaknesses of what we do. So a chance to begin that conversation. The next one is it's actually 2 weeks from today. We're going to do a webinar on screening for spiritual needs. A lot of chaplains are trying to find the best practices for how to screen to identify who are the patients who need us the most. So this will be sharing from two colleagues who have implemented some screening with their nursing colleagues in the inpatient context in 2 different hospitals. And this is going to be the kickoff of a work group that Transforming Chaplaincy is forming to kind of continue conversations about best practices for screening in the in and outpatient context. So I hope you can join us for that. And I think we have one more. Yeah. So betwixt and between the unique role of healthcare chaplains in promoting patient-centered care and medical decision-making, Jeannie Wurpser has organized this webinar in conjunction with Robert Klutzman, who's a psychiatrist and researcher in New York, who's been examining the important role of chaplain in decision-making. So we hope you can join us for these. Stay in touch with the Chaplaincy, Transforming Chaplaincy newsletter for our different activities. And again, thanks, Anja, Allison, Simon, Pamela. Really appreciate your help today. And we're going to say goodbye.